The popularity of the concept of children's agency grew out of critiques of child development, sociology and anthropology, in which children were treated and perceived as passive subjects. In response, childhood studies asserted that children are and can be, and even should be, social actors. From there grew a crescendo of interest in children's agency, underpinned by a host of qualitative research studies showing how children are in fact agents across different contexts and settings. This trend likely arose from researchers' ethical and political agendas. They wanted to support the visibility of children, the value of children, and promote children's rights. But whilst agency was often mentioned within childhood studies literature, it was rarely defined or conceptually discussed. It has, however, been much discussed in sociology. For example, Giddens in 1984 provides a seminal definition, stating that an agent ceases to be such if he or she loses the capability to make a difference, that is, to exercise some sort of power. This definition is part of Giddens' structuration theory, and though he didn't develop this in relation to children or childhood, it does helpfully point to the relationships between structure, systems, agency, and power. In other words, people can and do have the power through their actions to change the very social structures and institutions in which they live and work. And so when applied to children, it's true to say that they too can exercise some power and make a difference. Amartya Sen's understanding of freedoms and capabilities is also helpful when considering children's agency, although his work was not conducted in relation to children and childhood specifically. Freedoms include a person's capability to be considered and consider themselves to be someone who matters, someone who has a voice and is heard and counts. If someone has capability for a voice, to express their points of view, this in turn enables them to exercise agency and influence the decisions that affect them. Agency involves decision-making and action, and so a child's capability for agency is rooted in their capacity to both make decisions and act on them. But in fact, agency goes beyond capacity. It requires attention to context and involves influences that trigger, support, and inhibit agentic practice. Talking in relation to children and childhood, Robson and colleagues provide a useful definition of agency as an individual's own capacities, competencies, and activities through which they navigate the context and positions of their life worlds, fulfilling many economic, social, and cultural expectations, while simultaneously charting individual and collective choices and possibilities for their daily and future lives. However, children's agency, as it's been used, has been problematic in several ways. So first, it's tended to be presented as innately positive, as something which enables children to exercise freedom or realise their rights to participate. But exercising agency isn't inherently positive or negative, and when agency goes against the grain of moral and social orders, it is seen as questionable, in stark contrast to normative ideas which render it either problematic agency or agency that's absent entirely, not even seen as expressions of agency because it doesn't conform to recognisable and acceptable forms of the right kind of agency. Second, children can be blamed if they're perceived as not exercising agency, or made to feel more vulnerable by insensitive insistence to exercise agency. And third, agency is neither static nor exists in a vacuum. Rather, children's ability to exercise agency changes over time and space, and it's exercised within structures and contexts and constraints which can thicken or thin agency by expanding and constraining the range of viable choices. Such criticisms have led to more critical stances on children's agency emerging in the literature, and these continue to reflect the importance of studying children's agency, but suggest a less celebratory and more critical, more reflective stance is taken. This work moves us away from conceptualising agency as a characteristic of an individual child or as something they possess. Considering agency as relational and contextual rather than a fixed characteristic of a child is an important shift in thinking. It positions agency not as something that a child has or owns, but something they exercise or express in a given context and which is relational in nature. This work recognises that agency is exercised in particular social, cultural, economic and political contexts, and is something that arises from the connections children have with others, the decision and action, or the collection of decisions and actions, recognisable as agentic practice. In other words, the expressions of agency that are visible to others and achieve certain effects or outcomes. Other critiques go further to suggest that such attention to the relationality of agency requires that we reconsider some of the theoretical underpinnings of the concept of agency. For example, agency is often discussed through a lens of individualism and notions of the self. So concepts of autonomy, self-efficacy and self-confidence are often used to talk about agency. But Issa and colleagues discuss how agency's association with the autonomous individual has been inappropriately applied to more communal contexts in the global south, which value the social and the communal. In fact, in some parts of the world, notions of identity are inherently relational and not individualistic. They're deeply connected with family and community positions, roles and responsibilities. And agency is exercised in ways which reflect this relationality in everyday life. And so going further, I've suggested that we need to take a more culturally grounded approach to understanding agency. And this means going beyond the use of children's perspectives in our understanding of agency to instead develop situated theories of agency, which tell us something about the social and cultural components of agency from place to place. This more nuanced approach has the effect of making agency visible, revealing not just the shape agentic practice takes in children's lived experiences, but the deep cultural elements that are responsible for shaping agency in different local contexts.